So in the meantime, we are now going to bring on Mario Morales. He is the Group Vice President of IDC's Enabling Technologies, Semiconductor, Storage, and Datasphere Research. We have had him on before. He's been a really huge, he's really well versed in the chip shortage. So we're going to talk a little bit about why it's going on. Last time we talked was back in June, so we want to talk a little bit about how we're still here. So Mario, thank you so much for calling in and joining us. I really appreciate it.
Hi, Julia. Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you sound great.
Okay, great.
So like I was saying, the last time we spoke was in June, and we were sort of doing a little bit of an overview of how we got here. So quickly, can you recap to me, how did we get here? Certainly now into almost November with this chip shortage. What exactly has been going on?
I think there have been various factors. The first one is the fact that a lot of the industry underinvested in 2019 during a period of correction for the total semiconductor market. So that was one of the key points. And then due to the pandemic and the shutdowns that we saw in 2020, there was so much uncertainty, and that affected how companies could sort of forecast outward. They couldn't see, they didn't have a lot of visibility for beyond maybe a couple of weeks. And so it became harder and more challenging for these companies to forecast. And that sort of just upended the supply and demand situation that we see today. Now, what's changed since June? I think that the supply chain shortages are now shifting. They're moving from the front end, which is where we saw a lot of the shortages, now to the back end. And that's where a lot of the bottleneck is today, where you're looking at the fact that a lot of companies can't get wafers, substrates, crystals and quartz and chemicals, a lot of these important ingredients that you need to build chips. And not only that, but the back end now. So now that TSMC is catching up to demand, those products still have to ship to a testing company or an assembly company or a packaging company in Southeast Asia. But there's a bottleneck there now because, again, underinvestment, but also the fact that there's been rolling blackouts in that region, and they still can't get workers to come back to work full schedules and stuff. So we're seeing some of those challenges that still persist.
So I'm wondering how your outlook, and certainly your group's outlook on the chip shortage, has evolved. And is it, maybe it's tough to compare, but is it worse now than it was previously, let's say when we spoke in June, or at the very least, are we really in the thick of it now? Is it going to ease up? What's the outlook?
I think that it depends on where you're at in the supply chain. So if you're a front end semiconductor supplier, or you're one of the big suppliers like a Qualcomm or Broadcom or even an Intel, you're managing through this and you're actually still executing and reporting very good growth numbers. So I think the chip companies, they're definitely enjoying the tightness of the industry. They're able to capitalize that in terms of revenue growth. Where you're seeing still it's gotten worse, especially in September and October timeframe, has been in the channel. So if you're an aftermarket company, a distributor, or a small reseller, you've been double ordering from your suppliers in order to get as much product as you can. So in that perspective, you're probably in a worse situation. Your cash flow is also being impacted because you have to make more orders than even your customers are demanding. So I would say from that perspective, it's improved for the semiconductor industry as a whole, but it is getting a little bit worse for some of the folks at the back end. If you're doing transport and logistics, there's so much happening there. I mean, you can go to any major port now in the United States and you're seeing just a tremendous amount of ships just waiting to be docked and unloaded. And a lot of it has to do with the workforce, the unions not really adhering to some of the demands that they're seeing. And just in general, the transportation system is just not adequately stepping up to take care of some of these issues.
Got it. So when we last spoke, the chip shortage's impact on the automotive industry was sort of the main topic of discussion. And just judging by recent news, just yesterday or perhaps 2 days ago, GM reported lower profits in Q3. So it seems like automakers are still very much like feeling the squeeze. And are they still, I don't know, bearing the burden of it, so to say? Is that still the industry that's most affected?
I would say that that's the industry that's going to take the longest to recover.
Okay.
I think if you have to, part of the conversation we had back in June was that these automotive companies, they shut down in the second quarter of 2020, and they didn't really begin to manufacture again until August, September timeframe. By that point, they realized that they were going to start falling short from a supply standpoint, but they canceled a lot of orders during that period of time. So fortunately for the semiconductor industry, there were so many demand pulls that they were seeing. And so they shifted to these other sets of customers. So essentially the automotive industry moved to the back of the line. Now, what we found over this period of time, especially throughout 2021, is that there's still a lot of inefficiencies within the automotive supply chain. So even though now you can get parts, it still takes time to put those parts into a subsystem that ultimately make it into a vehicle. And so I think that the automotive industry as a whole will probably not recover until the second half of next year.
What about other industries that are now starting to really feel the pinch of the chip shortage? Just coming to mind, and we just talked about this a little bit previously in our previous segment about even, consumer and certainly, enterprise grade electronics. There is a certainly difficulty, it seems, and longer wait times perhaps than usual to get these devices. Is that a result of this chip shortage?
Yes, it definitely is. I mean, if you go back to the beginning of this year and even late last year, there were specific areas that were just really strapped. And a lot of them were also consumer related areas. So you think about game consoles, even to this point today, the lead times for GPU subsystems and graphics cards for gaming is still very long. And they've actually extended a lot more. And that's just a demand pull there that you're seeing, and just the inability for the suppliers to keep up. I think that when you start going into consumer electronics, there are some specific parts like power supplies and some specific analog parts and discretes and passives. These are, I would call, adjacent products that make up the total system. But if you don't have access to those products, you can't finish the system itself. And so you're going to still see companies struggle to get those parts. I do believe it's beginning to ease a little bit, especially as we close out the year. Once we get through the Chinese New Year next year, I think things will start looking a little bit better across some of these markets. But in areas, like I mentioned before, in areas like substrates and quartz and chemicals, those markets will take longer to recover just because it does require investment to build up that capacity that you need. So it'll be more on the back end.
Got it. What about any other industries? We talked automotive, consumer electronic. Are there any other industries that come to mind? And it's okay if the answer is no, that this chip shortage is affecting. And perhaps, I don't know, a little known industry. I think it's fascinating and certainly something that has come to the forefront during this chip shortage is the public realization of just how much is powered by semiconductors and how reliant a lot of devices that we use day to day are, whether it's your car, obviously your phone. And I would imagine that it's not just your phones in the cars, right?
Yeah, it's everything. I think that semiconductor technology as a whole has become very ubiquitous. So whether it's a wearable product that you have or something in your smart home, or maybe an industrial PLC system or tool, all of these different systems now rely more on semiconductors. And one of the key things that we've learned over the last year or so is that there's been a tremendous amount of content growth. Not a lot of people talk about the reality, but the fact is that one of the other reasons why we're seeing some of the shortages and they're really taking longer to recover is because the content within any type of major electronic system is growing. So I'll take a typical smartphone. 5 years ago, and you look at 5 years ago and today, the content in a phone has essentially doubled, especially with 5G. So there's a lot more complexity, there's a lot more computation. You're seeing more sensors and cameras being put on the device. And so that will continue to be one of the things that the semiconductor industry will have to continue to address. And that's why you're seeing the levels of investment that an Intel or a Samsung or TSMC are making. These guys are going to spend over $100 billion each just to address some of these opportunities. You look at Samsung and Micron and even SK Hynix, they're also committing hundreds of billions of dollars to address the opportunities that they see ahead. And so I see some of these things are going to get resolved, but it takes time to build this capacity into the supply chain.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. So we again, when we previously spoke, I know I'm referencing this, seemingly infamous discussion that we had back in June, and I will link that in the description if anyone wants to, compare then versus now. But when we spoke, or perhaps just in general, the general thinking was that at least the chip shortage would ease in Q3. Well, here we are in Q3. And even Intel CEO Pat Gelsinger said that he expects the shortage to ease up in 2022, but perhaps continue into 2023. What's the timeline look like? Because I know that you're saying, it's recovery times are certainly going to vary for industries.
Yeah, they do vary. And it's not just because every company has a different role that they play within the supply chain. I think if you look in general at the foundry industry, which supports a lot of the fabless companies, they're already getting close to meeting the expectations of their customers. If you look closely at the memory sector, which accounts for about a third of the total semiconductor market, the Samsungs and Kioxia and Microns of the world, they're starting to see some price erosion that began early in October. And again, there are some signs where you're starting to see this turn a bit. When you listen to Intel, I think Intel definitely has seen its own challenges. The challenges are not only related to the shortages, but also business challenges and execution challenges as a company. So each company will definitely have a different scenario. I still believe that the majority of the foundry industry began to catch up by the end of this third quarter. And it gets better by the end of this year. But there are certain parts, especially for mature technologies, if you look at things like LCD controllers or SSD controllers or power management ICs, all of these different technologies have a common denominator. They use the same process node technology. And a lot of that process node is where it's really tight for the semiconductor industry. So in those areas, definitely you're seeing some lingering effects, and some of it will probably begin to recover in the first half. But I think if we're not careful as a supply chain within I'm talking more about the semiconductor space, you could essentially even see some oversupply in the second half of next year. And so I think we've been talking a little bit about this since June, just because we are seeing a tremendous amount of capital being invested in this space. Mm-hmm. And it takes time to build the fab, sometimes 18 to 24 months plus time to ramp. But there are certain companies that have been already building this capacity, and some of it is coming online now, and some of it coming online by the middle of next year. And so it's more important to kind of look at where will demand be in 2022. I mean, and especially as we go back to work, we're starting to see that demand for Chromebooks, for example, has begun to dry up a little bit, right? And demand for low-cost Windows devices, because kids are going back to school, because we're going back to our offices, right? So there are certain market segments that are now beginning to see some changing effects, right? The travel industry hasn't yet really recovered, even though we're seeing gas prices soar at this point. And some of this is, again, supply driven, but at some point in time, those things do have an impact on the economic viability of every consumer, right? They only have a certain amount of budget that's allocated to these goods. And so we'll see where the demand picture ends up next year, but we're looking at that very closely. And that's why we provided the scenario that we did.
Got it. So I just have one sort of follow-up question there. You talked about perhaps seeing oversupply. What is... to me, that sort of seems like it could be perhaps bad news for the semiconductor industry, because they've got just a lot of product on their hands, and would this technology, become outdated? But what does oversupply look like for the semiconductor industry, I guess?
I think that one of the things that the semiconductor companies have learned over the years has been that the semiconductor industry always goes through periods and cycles that are up and down. And I think they're reacting much better than they have in the past. I think suppliers in areas like memory, for example, it's basically operating like oligopolies. So they definitely control the amount of supply that's out there and the perception of how tight the market is. And so if the industry starts changing from a demand scenario, in the second half, you could see some of these companies begin to push out orders of semiconductor equipment. And so some of the lines that they thought they would have online by the end of the year maybe don't happen until the following year. And so you're going to see some maneuvering along those paths just to be able to balance out supply and demand. But I think it's important for the entire industry to keep looking very closely at where demand is going, whether it's PC demand or demand for smartphones or what we're seeing in terms of the build out for infrastructure. We're also looking very closely at what the U.S. plans to do from a stimulus standpoint for infrastructure and how that plays out over time. I think some of these investments will be critical to watch because it could extend the demand curve that we're seeing today and the cycle that we're seeing today.
So just to wrap up, you've obviously spoken a lot about that investment is needed for this shortage to end. And I guess I'm curious what some of those investments look like. Investment in capital, certainly, but is there also an investment in, recruiting people to work and be able to make these devices? Is there going to be need? It seems like people capital. What other investments do they need to be making an investment in people?
I think that you're still seeing a lot of investment by the semiconductor industry in areas like R&D.
Okay.
A lot more investment in software. I mean, you talked earlier with some of your other colleagues. They were talking about the fact that there's just so many different companies now entering the semiconductor foray.
Absolutely.
And a lot of it has to do with the fact that they realize that the closer you couple hardware and software, the more you can differentiate your system, whether it's an iPhone or a Pixel system. All of these different devices require very close-knit collaboration between the hardware and software. And so I see a lot more investment happening from semiconductor suppliers in areas like software, where more of the R&D is headed more in that direction, because that's where you're seeing a lot of the differentiation. I think there's going to be a lot more investment by companies moving more of their data continue to move the data to the cloud, but at the same time, expanding their reach into the edge, because there's a big opportunity that's beginning to unfold at the edge, where all of these endpoints are getting more intelligent and they're beginning to drive more data. And in some cases, some industries like industrial or retail, or even in your vehicle, you want that data to be processed in real time. So there's not going to be any time for you to take that data back to the cloud and have it make a decision and bring it back to your vehicle. By then, you'll be in an accident, right? Especially if it's an autonomous vehicle. So I think there's a lot of investment that you're going to still see in areas like automotive and software. You're seeing, of course, heavy investments by the big three guys, TSMC, Samsung, and Intel, in process technology. And they're making big bets, and they're actually almost forcing their customers to align with them so that it guarantees that when that capacity is ready, these customers will be ready to adopt it.
Got it. Well, thank you so much, Mario, for calling in and joining us. I think this is really insightful. So just to wrap up here, I really appreciate it, like I said, and thank you all so much for watching this episode of Today in Tech. If you liked this video, please do give it a thumbs up. And if you're watching on LinkedIn, you can head over onto our YouTube channel, IDG Tech Talk. You can give the video a thumbs up there, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon so you're notified every single time we post a new video. If you have any questions or comments that we didn't get to, or you're watching this after the fact and you'd like to ask them, please do leave them in the comments below, and I will do my best to get back to you. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time.